Welcome to America and Arizona Government for Elementary Teachers. This is Presentation 1, The Role of the State. In this presentation, we'll have a brief introduction to the course in general, and then we'll focus in on why we have governments. Now, school teachers need to understand how their national and state governments operate for several reasons. They need to be able to construct lesson plans to help their students develop the fundamental skills of citizenship. In addition, teachers are often affected by the outcomes of political processes as national, state, and local legislators and administrators make decisions that affect the content and manner of their instruction and the resources available to them. I remember a while ago, a friend of mine who traveled around the state evaluating English as second language programs found an instructor. She went to an instructor to evaluate her English immersion program. And she came there the day after the Arizona election had happened. And on that election, there had been a proposition to eliminate English immersion programs. And that proposition had passed. So she went to this teacher's classroom and evaluated her program. And she reported to me that it was an excellent program. It was exemplary. She was doing everything right. The students were making progress. They were excited to be there. The teacher was excited. And it was a model English immersion program. And so my friend gave that feedback to the teacher, told her what a wonderful job she was doing, and then said, what are you going to do now that the proposition has passed? And the teacher just looked at her with sort of stunned eyes and blinked and said, what proposition? Now that is not an ideal situation to be in as a teacher. This teacher had a great program that had just become illegal the day before because of a proposition that was passed. And this teacher was unaware that this debate was even occurring outside of her classroom. So it's important for teachers to be aware of what's happening, but also understand the political system so that they can comprehend what's happening, but also affect the outcome of those debates that occur in society. This course will examine the theoretical foundations of our system and of national and state government. It will explore the workings of all the actors and agencies that are in the system and highlight the ways and the means to both create and block change in policy that affects every one of us. This course will provide you with the detailed background that you'll need to teach government in Arizona's elementary and middle schools, as well as help you gain the tools necessary to be an active participant in directing and shaping public policy. This course is not a test preparation course to pass the Arizona Educator Proficiency Assessment, the AEPA exam for middle school social studies. It's a college course where you will get a lot more material than you need just to pass a proficiency exam. But we will cover the AEPA objectives in the course of covering the material in this course so that you can become highly qualified and teach the subject that you're hoping to be able to teach. This course will cover Field 6 of the AEPA exam. Field 6 is the political science and American government section. In addition, it will also look at the Strand 3 of the Arizona Social Studies Standard. Strand 3 is the civics and government section. Now, this course is designed to complete the social behavioral general studies requirement at ASU and the U.S. Arizona Constitution state teacher certification requirements. This particular presentation will relate to the AEPA Test Objective 1, Understanding Political Science Terms, Concepts, and Theories, and the Social Studies Strand 3 Concept 4, the rights, responsibilities, and roles of citizenship. I would suggest you pause the presentation and review the social studies standard articulated by grade level document and look at the objectives under concept 4 and review those so that as we begin talking about these concepts, you can look for those that will be related to the grades K through 8. Then, after this presentation, I would again recommend that you review these objectives and consider how your understanding of these objectives has changed so that you can identify what you've learned in this particular presentation and how to fit those objectives listed in the social studies standards and the APA back into the larger picture of how the government operates. To begin, let's engage in a thought exercise called the tragedy of the commons. This example was first given by an economist named William Foster Lloyd in the 1830s and then popularized by an ecologist named Garrett Hardin in the 1970s. It's useful to illustrate a few of the concepts we want to begin with. So imagine that you live in a pre-industrial village, pictured here in the slide. There is no government and there's no outside rules that imposed on your village. Your village lives the same way it's lived for generations. In this village, all the people who live there have their homes, their gardens, and their cows. The homes are represented by the little squares in the diagram. And these cows graze all day, each day, in the commons area. Now this area is open to all, which is why it's called the commons, and it's shared by the community. In the morning, people take their cows from their pens, take them to the commons area, and let them graze all day long. And then in the evening, they come back. They bring their cows out of the commons area, put them back in their pens. And this has been the daily pattern of life for generations and generations. Recently, though, scientists at the local college have completed a study on the carrying capacity of your commons area. You see, the problem is that most grazing animals, like goats or sheep, when they're eating grass and they get to the bottom, the nub of the grass, they'll stop and they'll go on to find something else to eat. And if they can't find something else to eat, they go hungry. Cows, on the other hand, are not that bright, and they eat down to the nub, and if they can't find more grass, they just keep on eating, and they actually destroy the plant. They eat the grass down to its very roots. This destroys the plant so it doesn't grow back, which actually reduces the carrying capacity even further than it was before the cows got overly hungry. Now this is one consequence of overgrazing, and if we look at the federal lands throughout the West, it's actually quite a problem because cattle have overgrazed and destroyed the native plants and altered the carrying capacity of the ecosystem throughout the West. Now, this hasn't happened in your commons yet, though. The scientists, however, warn that the carrying capacity for your village appears to be 100 cows. Now, the problem that you have to deal with is that there are currently 125 cows grazing in your commons area. Now, the viability of the commons in the future is therefore being threatened. So an emergency meeting has been called for the village. Now, to keep the math easy, let's assume there are 50 households in this community that share the commons. Now, before advancing to the next slide, take a minute and think about what solution you might propose for how this community can protect its commons from overgrazing and thereby ensure that the commons area stays healthy for generations to come. Now, given the numbers, most groups presented with this problem determined that each household should have a 2-cow limit. Now, this agreement will keep the community within the 100 cow limit and thereby avoid overgrazing commons. It seems like a fairly reasonable way to go about it. Other suggestions that have commonly come up would be to privatize the commons and not worry about a collective problem. That gets complicated though, because inevitably conflict will result over deciding who gets which parcel, because the grass is indeed greener on the other side of the fence quite often. Another solution is to go with a per capita allotment, meaning big families get more than 2 cows, small families get less than 2 cows. For the sake of argument though, let's assume that this village has agreed on a 2 cow per family limit. There's all the hands go up, majority rules, and it's decided that in this village you'll stick to a 2 cow per family cap. That night, the scent of barbecue beef wafts through the air as some people remove their excess cows from the marketplace. The next morning, everyone takes their cows out of their pens, walks them to the commons area, and lets them go out, just as happens every other day. And a head count is made of how many cows are out there, and turns out there's 108 cows. So not everybody had a barbecue the night before. Now it's better. It's not 123. 15 cows have been removed, but we're still exceeding the carrying capacity. Somehow we've got to get at or below the 100 cow limit. So what do? Well, often when this situation comes up, a suggestion is made that we need to count the cows each day and identify who's bringing more than 2 cows. So someone volunteers to do that. I'll count the cows. Well, the next day, they go through, and sure enough, you're able to find out there's 3 or 4 families in the community that have more than 2 cows each. Well, now what? Well, you could try some social pressure, mock them, criticize them, tell them they're not going to be invited to the next party. But maybe they don't care, because cows, after all, are an indicator of wealth. And the more cows you have, the more stable and secure your family will be. And so they are immune to that kind of social pressure. Well, now what? Can you just say you're not allowed to bring more than 2 cows? But they can come back and say, well, I've brought more cows every day my whole life. My father used this commons and had 5 or 6 cows. My grandfather had several cows. You have no right to tell me that I can only bring in 2 cows. And so they bring in their 4 or 5 cows. So now what do? You can't pressure them. Reason hasn't worked. What are you going to do? Well, one option is to physically bar them from bringing their extra cows in. But that is going to lead to an altercation of some kind, because they want to bring their cows in. Maybe you have big guys with sticks stand at the gate to prevent them from bringing cows. But maybe they'll bring their relatives with even bigger sticks to come and force their way into those cows. There's also the problem of the person who's counting cows each day. As the cows come through, that person sits there all day tending the commons. Well, their garden is infested with weeds because they're not taking care of their own business. Their kids are starting to look like ragamuffins. They're not being taken care of adequately. And so we can't rely on a volunteer cow counter every single day. Maybe you can rotate whose turn it is going to count the cows. Maybe the cow counter needs to be given a sword to enforce that 2 cow limit. The problems get more and more complicated as you attempt to devise solutions to come to it. And this is where we lead to this question of why we need to have government. In the first place, every society needs order. The safety of the community needs to be secured. It's not just the guys with more cows than they ought to have. There's other problems every community faces. There are people who commit crimes of passion. They do things that they wouldn't otherwise do, and the society has to deal with the repercussions of that. Every society has its share of predators within it who will attempt to take advantage of those around them. And to complicate things even further, as your community is trying to figure out how to get under that 100 cow limit, you notice that the neighboring village, who has their own commons problem, is standing on the hill drawing detailed maps of your commons in your village. And so there may be an external threat that needs to be addressed. Well, historically, these needs have been met by governments to have an institution in a society that will guarantee safety, will guarantee the public order, will enforce contracts, and will protect from threats that are external or internal. In addition to securing society, every society also needs to solve collective problems. The example that we've given with the tragedy of the commons is that there is a collective issue of trying to protect the commons area, protect the sustainability of that commons area. But other communities, other societies have their own versions of these collective action dilemmas. For example, what is the appropriate amount of pollution that an industry ought to be able to emit? Can I take a mountain and turn it inside out in my search for precious minerals at the bottom of that mountain, and in the process pollute all of the neighboring watersheds and streams? Well, if it's my mountain, maybe that's what I can do. But there are collective impacts to my behavior if I do that. So how free of pollution ought a society be? How much education ought a society have? And is there a collective response to dealing with that? How about health, and particularly immunizations, that as 90 some odd % of children are immunized, then that creates a herd immunity where even people who haven't been immunized are still protected from the disease because most of the people in that society have been immunized. Well, that kind of herd immunity isn't possible unless there's a collective organization to immunizations. So these are the kinds of problems that can only be solved through the collective action of a community. Individuals can't solve these problems by themselves. And organizing those collective responses has traditionally been a function of government. A related problem is that every society needs to allocate collective resources. Who decides who gets what in a society? Who decides who gets the most choice parcels of land? Who decides who gets assistance and who does not get assistance? Who decides how much water a farmer has versus a business operator versus a homeowner? These decisions have to be made. Otherwise, conflict will occur surrounding these collective resources. You can think back to the range wars in the West, where the cattlemen were fighting with the farmers or the sheep men, and those were battles conducted by the private sphere over who had access to a collective resource, which was the rangeland of the West. Well, government helps solve those kinds of problems. Government did help solve those problems in the West, and it was the assertion and imposition of government authority that ended the range wars that were occurring. Finally, every society simply has its share of jerks, whose cooperation must be coerced, just as the example of our tragedy of the commons, where you have a fairly reasonable agreement that each family will have 2 cows. There's going to be a couple of people who are immune to social pressure because they don't care what other people think, have strongly held opinions, and don't particularly care who else they hurt in their own quest for personal gain or power, prestige, or whatever they're going after. We only need to look as far as our own society, or your own circle of friends for that matter. I'm sure you know who we're talking about here. We all know people who are not bound by the same social limits that most other people are bound by. Well, one function of government is to enforce some of those boundaries so that the jerks among us are compelled to behave themselves. Now, we'll talk more about that particular role of government in a subsequent presentation, but it helps us understand why government is there. These things combined lead us to our conclusion that every society needs a cow counter. They need some entity to stand at the gate and enforce the community's rules. In this case, it's 2 cows per family, but it might be a speed limit, or it might be that a divorced father has to pay child custody or child support. Whatever the decision is, you need an entity to enforce that, to enforce the society's norms and rules on those who have to be compelled because they will not limit their own behavior. An entity that is capable of allocating collective resources and following the will of the community in determining who gets what. An entity that is able to solve collective problems or bring the people of that community together in order to solve those collective problems. And an entity which will protect us from the predators among us and also from foreigners who may threaten our safety or our property. Historically, these are the functions that government has played. And if you look far back in prehistory to the origin of government, it's typically a local warlord who has performed these functions in their own society, who's just better at smashing people's skulls than the neighboring warlord and gets more and more powerful. Now we've moved beyond the smashing skulls bit so that modern government looks different, but the basic functions haven't changed a whole lot. We have a cow counter, and that is who the government is. In the next presentation, we will look more closely at how states have limited their power, how we've gone from the warlord smashing skulls to a set of institutions that derive their consent from those who are governed. This concludes the first presentation, so remember to review the objectives that have been covered before we move on to the next presentation. This presentation is courtesy of Brian Dilley. I'm the speaker, and I'm a professor of political science at Mesa Community College, a college of the Maricopa Community College District in Mesa, Arizona. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation.